A Fox 21 News special report. A city under fire. Its people at risk. Their heroes put to the test. Tonight, we remember your stories from the Waldo Canyon fire.
In a situation like this where the information is changing rapidly.
The fire was within 1,000 yards of our home.
This morning, the fire was spreading at a rate of about a quarter to a half a mile an hour.
There's so much information out there.
The weather quickly changed. We had cloud coverage. Winds really started to pick up.
If I told you an acreage right now, it would be wrong in about 10 minutes.
And I think all of our jaws just dropped and our hearts just sank.
Every second and every minute counts that you're taking an action.
News is a bad deal.
On June 23, 2012, the city of Colorado Springs was devastated by a fast-moving wildfire. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Cole, news director here at Fox 21. That day and the days that followed, we were in wall-to-wall coverage. Our entire team actually behind the scenes, on the streets and in the community covering that story.
I'm Abby Burke.
And I'm Craig Coffey, and today the scars of the Waldo Canyon fire remain. So tonight we remember the risk and highlight the work being done to make sure it does not happen again.
The Fox 21 team here with you again to take a closer look at the losses we suffered along the way.
If we would know that we would have the opportunity to save them, we would have tried everything we could to.
74-year-old William Everett and his 73-year-old wife Barbara died when the Waldo Canyon fire swept into the Mountain Shadows neighborhood, burning their home on Rossmere Street and so many others nearby.
And it does hit hard when you're watching the collateral damage, but you just bite your lip and you give a little bit more.
Waldo Canyon fire destroyed 346 homes in just 12 hours, plus hundreds more were damaged. Ultimately, this fire burned more than 18,000 acres, and for so many, the enormity was hard to bear, impossible at times.
Oh my God, I'm leaving my house for probably the last time.
Well, we're going to hear more from those people most impacted in just a few minutes.
And those losses, there were in so many cases mitigated by the men and women of the Colorado Springs Fire Department and other agencies.
We saw crews working 16-hour shifts, sacrificing sleep and contact with their family because of their dedication to their mission to protect us.
And I look up and it's right in front of me. And I can tell you that as soon as I saw that, my gut just went, oh, this is bad.
And there was no way to know at the time just how bad it would become.
You know, it stirs up emotions from a decade ago when we were in here.
It's hard to imagine the wrath the Mountain Shadows community endured during the Waldo Canyon fire.
This is an area right here where the fire front hit initially. This is Alabaster and Wilson.
Those who fought the fire, face to flames, experienced a living hell they'll never forget.
Raining fire, you know, embers.
Flames reached high into the sky and embers spread from home to home.
We're triage, just like you would triage medical patients, we're triaging structures at that point because we know people are safe. But it's hard because you're making the decision that we can't save this person's house.
The Waldo Canyon fire was a fire unlike Colorado Springs had ever seen.
We have lost homes before in grass fires, but not to the magnitude of this.
Firefighters sprang into action with local law enforcement by their sides, evacuating homes as quickly as possible.
So we had police officers and firefighters knocking on doors, verifying that people had left. The good part of this whole story is that we did an amazing job, and we only lost 2 who chose not to leave, and then they were unable to leave.
The loss of those lives was difficult.
We did have to go back and recover them. Our crews did, same crews, you know. But yeah, again, we're sad. You know, we don't want to lose anybody.
But the fire was consuming everything in its way, moving 60 to 80 miles per hour at times.
We had to withdraw to save our personnel and our equipment. And as soon as that fire front had come through this neighborhood, we immediately re-engaged. and we had houses on fire and trees on fire.
Exhausted firefighters relied heavily on their training and any past experience they had.
You identify water supply, you identify resource availability, and you start plugging in your game plan.
And they attacked, fighting valiantly until they couldn't work for another minute, grabbing a quick rest before they were back on the job again.
They would just lay down on the grass, like on the lawns, and try to take a 10-minute nap if they could.
Every second and every minute counts that you're taking an action. So there's not a moment to sit and ponder.
But as the years have passed, there's been plenty of time to ponder.
We look at the fire and what it did and how it behaved and what we could do on a similar fire in another neighborhood in Colorado Springs, or a similar fire in this neighborhood again.
Yes, it could happen again.
It just doesn't bode well for the next couple summers. One of the things he said that stuck in my mind was what has been our hot temperatures are, for the next couple summers, are going to be our normal temperatures, and then the hot's going to be above that.
You know, Matt, I've noticed since I've lived here that the summers have definitely been hotter and drier over the last 15 years.
Yeah, a lot of people say that, and if you look at the data, it does bear that out, Abby, especially since the year 2000. You know, I talk to people frequently who lived here in the 70s and 80s, and they'll say, you used to be able to set your clock by afternoon rain at 3 o'clock, and we don't get to say that as much anymore. So the climate is certainly changing.
We also know that weather played a really big role in Waldo Canyon fire and the destruction that happened in that neighborhood. So what happened that day that kind of changed the course of the fire?
Yeah, very quickly too. The fire sort of exploded on that Tuesday afternoon due to a very specific weather event that happened to the west of the fire, which we'll check out now.
Although we all saw the smoke from the Waldo Canyon fire on Saturday, June 23rd, the story of the fire really begins in the late winter and early spring. The first 6 months of 2012 were very dry across Colorado, and drought expanded rapidly across the state, as you can see in this series of images from the U.S. Drought Monitor. Even during the month of June, extreme drought expanded rapidly from the beginning to the end of the month. During the Waldo Canyon fire, the stretch of dry weather continued with record heat. In fact, 5 days in a row of record high temperatures concluded on June 26th when the fire came into town. In fact, on that afternoon, the hottest temperature ever recorded in Colorado Springs of 101 degrees was measured at the airport. A wave coming up from the southwest brought moisture in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, and instability over the mountains helped to develop some thunderstorms along the Continental Divide. Wind from these thunderstorms advanced east toward the Pikes Peak region and helped to develop some new thunderstorms between 3:30 and 5 o'clock. These thunderstorms intensified on the northwest flanks of Pikes Peak and quickly collapsed. This strong downdraft of air that resulted moved very quickly from west to east across the fire, and with wind gusts of 65 miles per hour reported that day, drew the fire into the Mountain Shadows neighborhood. Here's 3D radar. I'll loop it through 2 times. Watch the storms collapse on the left-hand side of the screen, and then Waldo's pyrocumulus cloud being pushed at the surface across the north side of the city. As it comes through again, notice how quick that change happened in the foothills as homes started to burn. Here's what it looks like on a time lapse from the northwest of town. The wind shift quickly occurring and changing lives forever. If the thunderstorms had never formed to the northwest of the fire that day, the history of Waldo Canyon fire on June 26, 2012 would be very different.
Well, thanks, Matt. And the temperature, those winds, along with the storm which Matt described, were all factors in this nightmare scenario for the Springs. So here now are the details of how this all unfolded. The call about smoke in the Waldo Canyon area came in on June 22nd, a Friday, and crews responded.
They just couldn't find it, and it was tied to a single tree up in the canyon there.
It was the next day, Saturday, June 23rd, that the fire became more apparent, and it spread quickly. That day, the Springs Fire Department requested air support. By the afternoon, it already grew to 600 acres, and it was spreading towards Chipeta Park, Green Mountain Falls, and Cascade. It put Manitou Springs at risk.
It just looked horrible. You know, it was, I knew that it was a really bad situation.
By June 24th, 11,000 people evacuated their homes. The next day, the fire spread into Queens Canyon in terrain which made it more difficult for firefighters to manage. On the 26th, Colorado Springs recorded a record high temperature of 101 degrees and winds of 65 miles an hour pushed the fire down the slope.
It doesn't matter how good your fire department is anywhere, that's Mother Nature taking control.
Into Mountain Shadows, Oak Valley Ranch in Peregrine.
This is my neighborhood. I'm going to protect it.
Burning embers created spot fires, and the Waldo Canyon fire began to spread from one home to the next.
Looked like the entire neighborhood was going up. They made a stand here and did not allow that fire to get across into the other neighborhood where there were hundreds of homes.
The Flying W Ranch also burned that day.
I was so sad for those that were losing their homes. I wanted it to stop.
By June 27th, the number of people evacuated hit 30,000.
But these guys took their stand, and it was a very valiant effort on their part.
It wasn't until July 1st that firefighters got 55% containment of the fire. And we had 95% containment on July 5th. And 5 days later, the Waldo Canyon fire was declared fully contained. And of course, once that immediate danger began to dissipate, we were all asking questions.
Right, and the big one we all wanted to answer was, how did it start?
And it's a question we're still asking 10 years later. We're going to hear more about that in just a few minutes.
It looks like a nuclear bomb went off. If you want to really picture what it looked like, look up some file footage of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the firebombing in Japan. We fought it as best as we could.
I've been on Manitou Fire Department for 37 years, and I've never seen the water like this. I've never seen this happen.
On the first day of the fire, a victory for the Colorado Springs Fire Department, and more importantly, the people who lived in Cedar Heights. But the movement of the fire and its deafening sound won't soon be forgotten.
Is when it roared in there, and so we could hear it, and it was like a freight train, and it probably, oh yeah, it was just tremendous noise, and it came running up that other side toward here Cedar Heights in that valley.
Not a single home was lost in Cedar Heights. Chief Randy Royal says that's because at first glance the fire appeared to be burning in the neighborhood, so they evacuated homes immediately. Now he describes the site as an optical illusion. The fire was still on the other side of the canyon, allowing crews time to dig fire lines and put other preventative measures in place. But others, particularly in the Mountain Shadows neighborhood, they were not given the same warning.
Yeah, there was a lot of changing information for people who evacuated and for those on standby for word on when to leave.
Those are the stories we think of most often when we remember the Waldo Canyon fire.
It had been moving to the northwest, so away from town. Well, that night it changed and started moving toward town, and I remember him and I looking at each other and said, it's probably going to come into town today, which it did.
Police knocked on my door. I opened up the door and he said, you got to evacuate. So I looked out over my front porch and they're just shooting out of the mountain.
And then we started counting the losses, land, houses, many destroyed, and somehow among those, several untouched.
I had to look twice and make sure I was on the right street. You know, you see it in pictures, but you really just don't, it just don't soak in until you actually see it. Here's my neighbor's house, but my three neighbors, they're still there, thank God.
And remember, a lot of the damage caused by the Waldo Canyon fire was either out of view or out of the scope of what you might expect. Fox 21's Storm Team explains.
And it's not just the people working to recover from the Waldo Canyon fire, but the landscape too. Here you see grasses filling in the burn scar, but 10 years ago, this looked completely different.
Oh my God!
Flooding and mudslides.
Look what's going on!
Wreaking havoc.
I mean, the impacts after a fire are instantaneous.
And we've found long-lasting.
You know, even a quarter inch of rain, the impacts of that are immense.
Heavy rains hitting the burn scar, triggering debris flows and rushing water over Highway 24.
We have all those loose soils, you know, basically burned loose soils. There's trees that were burned as well. The root systems are basically torched. A little bit of wind, a little bit of rain can knock this down and carry those downstream as the heavier rains pick up.
The Waldo Canyon wildfire burned plants and vegetation that would absorb heavy rain. But burn scars react differently.
The chemical compounds of the soil changes immediately.
And so we're kind of having to reassess, relearn how the water is going to react with, basically what's effectively concrete or asphalt at that point in time.
After a fire, burned vegetation coats the soil and it becomes hydrophobic, repelling the water instead of absorbing it. And in this state, it doesn't take much to cause a flash flood, carrying debris downstream extremely fast.
We have a bunch of dead trees that are still in the burn scar area. That debris flow could also include, dirt, mud, boulders, but also large logs from trees.
In a matter of minutes, the impact can change.
Depending on the steepness of the area that was burned as well too, the quicker those water can run off into those creeks and rivers, causing then downstream impacts to lives and property.
Flash floods are most extreme in the first 5 years after a wildfire.
So anytime we get something happen sooner than that, the better it is for us and the public as far as the warnings go and just the recovery in general.
In this case, we were lucky. Some burn scar recoveries can take up to 10 years.
Just due to how severe the fire was, the burn area was, and how hard it was for us to get in and try to help mitigate those impacts.
And part of the regrowth came from community mitigation efforts.
Replant some of those native grasses and trees to kind of, again, help solidify that soil so that way it cannot move during the next heavy rainfall event. And that was done for years after Waldo Canyon occurred.
Clear evidence of the Waldo fire still remains, from burned trees to empty space. But here too, signs of regrowth as this area continues to be under close watch. From the Fox 21 Storm Team, I'm Valerie Mills. And I'm Ashley Manfria.
Nothing but smoke. You can't even see anything.
And that right there is exactly why. I mean, look at those houses. Those are houses in the Peregrine area, and look at that smoke looming over it.
I want every single person that is commanding this and working it and everything to know how much I appreciate everything that they're trying to do to keep Colorado Springs, Colorado Springs.
We know the Waldo Canyon fire was human caused, but we don't know who caused it or how.
And in the years since this fire, Springs police said this case has gone cold.
I think it was somebody who was careless, and they were careless at the worst time for our community and the best time for conditions for a major fire.
Now that was Terry Makita, who was the El Paso County Sheriff at the time of the fire.
He tells Fox 21 News, unless someone comes forward with either a confession or new information, we may never know how the Waldo Canyon fire started.
Now Makita's perspective in this case, of course, totally unique. And Joe, you actually sat down with him, as well as Steve Bach, who was the Springs mayor at the time of this fire.
Did they give you some insight on what they went through during Waldo Canyon?
They did. And what was really surprising to me is while many were making decisions about their family and what to do for themselves, Makita and Bach, they were making decisions that was impacting all of us.
We know the statistics. 2 people dead, hundreds of homes lost, and thousands of acres burned. But what can get lost in the numbers is the fight.
If you remember, it was like this monster that kept probing which way it wanted to go.
The split-second decision-making.
Our staff came up to me on my ear and said, "You've got to evacuate."
And the stress.
I think the magnitude of which a fire can move, we probably weren't prepared for.
When Waldo Canyon first started, it was a county operation. City property was not yet in the crosshairs. It only took 1 day before the fire was encroaching on Highway 24, threatening populated areas.
We evacuated half Mountain Shadows on Saturday as a precaution, even though the fire was south of there.
Monday night, the fire burned very quickly back over a burn area and moved to the northwest toward Rampart Reservoir. And I remember when I saw the fire map update, I was shocked.
I went to that early Tuesday morning briefing, and the National Authority folks said to me, they said, "We think you can let people back into Mountain Shadows without restriction, because this fire is definitely trending west at this point."
By then, half of Mountain Shadows had been evacuated for days. Bach said a lot of those homeowners wanted to go back in.
The police chief, Pete Carey, Rich Brown, fire chief, Steve Cox, others, said, don't do it. Take the heat because this fire's changed too many times. Let people back in for half an hour to water their plants with police escort and get them out of there. And that's what we did. But I came pretty close. And I could have overridden those guys, but I wasn't going to.
Right.
They're the professionals.
Right.
So thank goodness I didn't do that.
Because on Tuesday, June 26th, everything changed.
We were faced east to the media.
Right now looks to be the most challenging time to fight the fire. You know, we worry about the winds, the speed and the direction. What happens at sundown is things will start to change.
And the sky was really black west of us. It did not look good.
It almost began to snow. It was the sky got very dark, and there was cold embers falling, and it looked like gray snow falling. And I remember my back was to the mountains. I'm looking at the people that were there for the press conference, and I'm thinking, where is that coming from? And why all of a sudden? And I thought to myself, this can't be good. It just can't be good.
I turned around, and it was a wall of fire coming down on top of mountain shadows. That's how quickly that happened. We've just been told that there now is an evacuation order for the balance of mountain shadows up through Peregrine.
I think probably one of the most underestimated decisions made was that of Mayor Bach, calling for the evacuation.
Because you were covering that live, and people were watching, fortunately, because if you hadn't been covering it, and people hadn't been watching it, we could have lost hundreds, if not more, people in that fire.
It seems like you blinked, and there was fire at 30th and Garden of the Gods, or Centennial. It just blew across the canyon, and it came down into that area in full attack mode.
I'm in charge. Did I not get people out there in time? Is this on me? So, which I would accept responsibility if that's the case, but it was unbelievably horrific.
Boy, I think the resiliency this community showed in the aftermath of Waldo really changed all of us for the better.
For sure, and there were some hard lessons learned.
So on the way, a closer look at now what we're using, how we're using those lessons as safeguards now moving forward.
How do they keep motivated to get this fire out, to make progress?
It's more than a job. That's why they do it, and it's in their blood.
We run on the edge and across the flames. The world we knew is not the same. Feel your soul, feel your desire. Walk through the fire.
The 10-year mark following one of the most devastating occurrences in Colorado Springs history gives us a really good opportunity to reflect.
It makes sense to look back and focus on what we've lost or the fear that we all felt, but it's also important to think about the future.
Let's take a look at then and now. Starting at where it all began, about 3 miles west of Colorado Springs. The Waldo Canyon fire spread over more than 18,000 acres, and the Burned Area Emergency Response Assessment Team said more than 3,000 acres were burned so severely that vegetation and roots any less than 4 inches underground were destroyed. But we are starting to see regrowth, and as you can see, the beauty is coming back.
And it's fair to say that the beauty keeps bringing more people to Colorado Springs, which can cause significant changes and challenges. More than 417,000 people lived in the Springs in 2012. That number at the time of the last data point, which was 2020, was more than 471,000 people. Also, growth in El Paso County shows a similar story, as numbers in 2012 were more than 620,000, which then jumped to more than 710,000 people in 2020.
And those numbers are significant. Today, those living on the west side of the city remember the difficulty people had getting out of their neighborhoods to safety.
People were leaving both communities, trying to get, to a safe location, and it was congestion. It was a traffic jam.
10 years ago, as homeowners grabbed what they could and left, traffic backed up on Garden of the Gods Road for miles. And the foreboding question is, would it be any easier if it happened today?
They haven't experienced it. They don't know about what they have to have prepared, ready to go. And so I think the city is too complacent.
Right now, West Side Watch, a group of people living on the city's west side, is voicing their concerns about growth in the city and how those numbers could crowd evacuation routes and slow people down in emergencies. The Pikes Peak Region Office of Emergency Management does have an evacuation plan. It was last updated in November of 2021.
But some say it doesn't take into account continued growth or factors such as climate change and, of course, weather conditions.
Still, city officials say we all have an individual responsibility to have a plan in place in case of an emergency. Although, as the Flying W Ranch experienced, not all plans pan out the way you hope.
After the fact, I was told by the firefighter that he had never, turned tail and ran. He had never stood down to a fire ever in his life.
The work and the sacrifice of those firefighters means the world to them, and they are genuine heroes.
Well, the massive reach and devastation of the Waldo Canyon fire had life-changing consequences for most people on the city's Upper West Side, but there was another family among the smoke and ash of burnt remains who lost everything. And not just the brick buildings with wooden fixtures, but also time, hard work, sweat, and sacrifice. Through 4 generations, those at Flying W Ranch entertained hundreds of thousands of visitors since 1953, with generous portions of chuck wagon dinners, great music, and good old-fashioned family fun, preserving the old ways of the West. But during those catastrophic moments in June of 2012, their future was threatened by a force never imagined before.
It's hard to take this all in. It's overwhelming.
Rachel, can you see in that black at all? Can you see any structures that have actually burned, or is that just land?
To be honest, Joe, I can't tell.
It's just awful.
An absolutely horrific, horrible day for this community.
When the fire first broke out,
right,
what's going through your mind?
We're going to lose the Flying W Ranch.
And it greatly saddens me tonight to have to share with you that we have multiple structures that are impacted in the Mountain Shadows community.
And Flying W Ranch is in that area.
I mean, I believe it was even confirmed that the Flying W Ranch is gone.
You came back, you see the aftermath. What's the thought process when it came to recovery and then rebuilding?
It was really hard to even begin to put our heads around it, really. And it took us a while to try and figure out, okay, what do we want to do? There was so much that we had to do to get back up on our feet if we were going to get back up on our feet.
Within this 10 years, before you opened, now since you've opened, is there something you've learned from all this, or how have you grown?
You know, during that period, we kept going back and forth. We're going to rebuild, we're not going to rebuild. If we didn't rebuild, it was going to be super hard on us because we knew that legacy was so deep and so wide. Millions of people had generations invested in the Flying W that people have done together as a family. But if we did rebuild, it was going to be hard on my family, which that is also true. It has been very, very hard on us. It has been a massive, massive labor of love.
Was there ever a thought that you would not reopen?
Many times, many times.
And what made you decide this is what we have to do?
It was finally over time, it just started winning out. It's just that I think the Lord takes care. He has a plan for this place.
Well, I want to mention this. The venue is gorgeous.
Thank you.
2 giant fireplaces.
Yes.
I'm going to the glasses for this. It's a big deal. So on one of the fireplaces, you have inscribed Isaiah 43, verse 2.
Right.
When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze.
Right.
Is that intentional?
Oh yes.
Fireplace?
Oh yes.
And what's the meaning of that to you?
We're here today. We made it through. He saw us through in every sense of the word. And I would say that's for life in general.
You'll get through the fire.
You're going to get through that fire.
So you might say the Flying W is flying again.
The Flying W is flying again. Yes, it is flying again.
Well, Leanne says that she feels blessed and wants to make sure that others know that she feels for everyone who suffered loss during the Waldo Canyon fire. So the Flying W Ranch is now open for their second full season, and memories of their Western experience are no longer in jeopardy.
This is remarkable video that you're seeing, and it's scary video all in the same.
Sad video. I mean, you can just tell how intense this fire is getting just by looking at this video.
know, the landscape is weird because it'll change dramatically. Parts of it you'll go through and there'll be house, and one house missing. And parts of it you'll go through, there'll be everything missing and one house standing.
Your local media and your team here at Fox 21 sprang into action as the fire moved into Colorado Springs. Our updates aired 24 hours a day for several days in a row. And tonight we want to tell you about what we saw.
All right, very good. Abby Burke reporting. At the time of Waldo Canyon, I was the news director and evening anchor for Fox 21 News.
Our web producer at the time called me and was like, hey, we have a report of a fire. Can you come in early?
Had you ever covered something like that?
No, I never did, and I don't think anyone here has done that, just something of that magnitude.
I think the longest day I worked was 22 hours, and I remember going home at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, feeling kind of guilty that I wasn't still there.
Sunday morning, early in the morning, they evacuated Manitou Springs. And that's when we decided, okay, that's 10,000 people. We need to get in there, we need to get on air and start giving people information.
People needed us.
Something like that is when local news plays its best role as a public servant.
When you have evacuations going on, it is super important to get that information to the community as quickly and as accurately as possible.
Pre-evacuation alert to all those people in North Mountain Shadows.
You're sitting there, you're trying to do your job and stay focused on that and try to give this information while at the same time you're like, wow, lives of people I know are changing right now. And you're seeing the evacuation and you're just wondering like how quick it came in, like did everyone get out?
The eerie thing I remember is no matter where you went in town, just the smell of the smoke.
I remember specifically something hitting me in the eye, on my eyelashes, and realizing that it was ash that was raining down on us.
I just ran into Megan, who's an evacuation.
There was someone who came down the hill carrying a pillowcase.
I had to come back and get my cat.
A lady came up to me and she said, you know, I work overnights. She said, I looked out my window and I could see the fire coming to my house. Your push alert saved my life.
That was a really hard but really important lesson that the entire community learned.
I want to make sure that the images and the video that I take is something that we can look back on 10 years, 20, 50, 100 years and remember that this happened here in our community.
Those days hit us all really hard, so we want to remember what happened, but also really examine what we're doing now. And we'll talk about that after this short break.
We can provide all the resources. We can make sure that they're well coordinated. But as I just told these firefighters, what we can't do is to provide them with the courage and the determination and the professionalism, the heart that they show when they're out there battling these fires.
As we talk about the Waldo Canyon fire, we can't help but think about how weather conditions now compare to what we saw back then.
And it's already been busy, with the fire department really stretched thin in May when 3 separate fires broke out, which caused 2 evacuations, and the other shut down powers in the Springs airport.
So we asked Chief Royal what he thinks about this summer.
I'm not optimistic based on the long-term forecasts. Right before the storms hit, every week we measure our fuel moistures, and that's what we base fire restrictions and fire bans on. And it took a big dive to where almost every single category was extreme, except for 2. And those were very high. That's not good, especially when we're not even in the summer yet. So we're anticipating it's going to be a busy summer.
The chief says they're focusing in on community awareness and talking about safety measures to put in place now, like mitigation. You can even have firefighters assess what you should do to add more protection to your home.
Yes, and now the CSFD has signed a contract with Zone Haven, which is already in use in states like California and Washington. And it's a computer program that develops zones for the city, which are about 200 zones for us. So the chief says it will allow the department to be very direct and only evacuate people as needed in real time by identifying which zone the fire is in and where the fire is going based on weather data.
No one saw this. No one could see this. This is heavy, heavy smoke.
One of the really remarkable things about the progression we've made since Waldo is communication and technology.
Yeah, that's something that Chief Royal and firefighters across the country now are really leaning into. And if they had then the equipment that we have now, Royal says the Waldo Canyon fire would never have happened.
As we now know, the Waldo Canyon fire, the very first start of it was reported on the 22nd, but crews couldn't find the single tree that was burning. Now the chief says they have multi-mission aircraft through state resources. It's equipped with infrared, which the chief says picks up on even small areas of heat.
They would have picked up that tree, give us the lat long of it, and we would have sent a crew up there and put it out before it even made a problem. And that's what we hope to do.
The Springs Fire Department also has its own drones now. Those also have infrared, and with new communication measures in place with both state and federal representatives, the fire department will be more proactive than ever.
Well, as journalists, it's the type of story we don't ever want to cover again. And it's one of those where were you moments, right? Well, we were right here. And if something like that ever happens again, I can guarantee you we'll be right back here again.
I think what stands out to me is how the public here rallies so much around each other. I think that's one of the great things about where we live.
Yeah,
and that was an example of that happening.
The community really came together and did so again the following year, which we will talk more about that next year. But I think it's an honor and a privilege to tell the community stories, both good and bad. And we just want to thank the community for allowing us to do that.
Absolutely. As journalists, that's our job. Our job is to get the information. And in crucial situations like this is to get it out to people as soon as possible. And that's what our goal was. And we feel like we accomplished that. But it was a tough week.
For sure, a time that our professional careers and the public will never forget.
Absolutely.
Yeah.